nature of fame in the 20th century. It's the first quarter of the 20th century, the era of mass newspapers, of silent film, an era that witnesses the creation of a new breed, the star. Mary Pickford is America's sweetheart, and Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckles his way to celebrity. A knockabout English comic, Charlie Chaplin, becomes the most recognizable human being on Earth. The early flickering images capture the greats of the day. Teddy Roosevelt displaying his rugged individualism. Henry Ford displaying his rugged individualism. Valentino, Houdini, Buffalo Bill, Lawrence of Arabia, Leo Tolstoy. Join us now for an intimate view of the giants of our time and the forces that created them, as Clive James' humor and insight reveal the strange chemistry that makes someone larger than life.
There was always fame. It started in the cave. But in the 20th century, fame turned into something different. Suddenly, there was much more of it. In our time, fame is everywhere. You can't get away from it. If you're famous and try to get away from your fame, you get more famous for trying to get away. If you aren't famous, you can't get away from hearing about people who are. It was never supposed to be like that. At the end of the 19th century, the general spread of education was supposed to make people more rational. After thousands of years of falling for every myth that came along, people were meant to be more skeptical, more critical, more able to see that famous people were just people like them. But it didn't work out that way. At the end of the 20th century, after almost 100 years of compulsory education for all, there are fully grown women who believe that this man is not dead. It's 20th century fame. This woman is famous for being Elizabeth Taylor. She has a full-time job being Elizabeth Taylor. She just is Elizabeth Taylor. When she started off, she was a screen star. That was what she did. She grew famous from doing it. The strange thing was that she didn't grow less famous after she stopped doing it. She grew more famous. There were no more big movies to star in, but her life was a movie, and she starred in that. Now she just is Elizabeth Taylor. We can guess why she clings to her fame. But why do we cling to her fame? Why do we need her? And why did we need him? Not just in America, but all over the world. Liberals said it was ridiculous that Ronald Reagan should even be a candidate for the presidency of the United States. They said that fame was the only thing he knew anything about. But there was no end to Reagan's fame. Quite the reverse. He was America's living symbol, a mobile section of Mount Rushmore.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
And if he was just an act, then he was a hard act to follow. He left a lot of people, and not just his critics, wondering about whether fame should be allowed to have power. Madonna was never in doubt. For Madonna, fame was power. She studied 20th century fame as if it had a history of its own. She studied it as if it was history, the only history that mattered. She turned herself into the culmination of 20th century fame, a self-motivated, self-managed, self-sustaining state of self-publicity, self-conscious and conscious of nothing else. There was scarcely a moment of the day when she wasn't hard at work being her. It was all right for her to be like that, but what if other people got the same idea? Pope John Paul II spent a lot of his time being on display too. Popes before him also appeared at the Vatican window to show themselves to the faithful. But this Pope showed himself all over the planet. His advisors had studied the techniques of 20th century fame. They knew what they were after: maximum exposure of an asset. He was a willing follower of their advice. But does 20th century fame really mix with piety? And does it really mix with royalty? The Princess of Wales became more famous than Madonna without even having to sing. She hardly even had to speak. She was very pretty, and she married the Prince of Wales. In ordinary circumstances, that would have been enough. But 20th century fame is not an ordinary circumstance. From the moment that Lady Diana Spencer agreed to be a princess, the process began that turned her into a cover girl, a model, a beauty queen, an object of dreams. She finally let it be known that it was all a bit much. She might have wanted to be famous in the first place, but she never wanted to be that famous. Perhaps all that publicity should never have been allowed to happen. Perhaps it was all a bit American. Because America is where 20th century fame really started, when the problem of how to satisfy the insatiable public desire for reading about famous people was solved by the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. He did it by making more people famous. He built up his friends as saints and branded his enemies as monsters. Later on, by a satisfactory irony, a famous movie handed Hearst the same treatment. In Citizen Kane, Orson Welles showed Hearst inventing the news.
Joseph, I'm absolutely starving. Well, they'll arrest us later and get back. No, I'm very hungry. Look, Mr. Carter, here is a 3-column headline in the Chronicle. Why hasn't the Inquirer a 3-column headline?
News wasn't big enough.
Mr. Carter, if the headline is big enough, it makes the news big enough.
That's right, Mr.
At the beginning of the century, movable type got the new kind of fame off the ground. Moving pictures were just a gleam in the laboratory. But it was an American laboratory. Thomas Alva Edison had his name on 2 of the principal inventions which would ensure that fame would actually shape 20th century history instead of just reflecting it. One of them was moving pictures, and the other was recorded sound.
It was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
In his old age, Edison enjoyed making a thrill-a-minute featurette about life at the laboratory. A sequence about testing light bulbs was especially gripping. But at the time he was inventing it, he never realized that his invention would make news. He thought it was just a passive device for recording an exciting day. At the start, that was what everyone who could afford a motion picture camera used it for. The first movies were home movies. Queen Victoria was already the most famous female monarch in the world since her compatriot Elizabeth I. Still photographs of her were displayed in silver frames on top of mahogany pianos in every corner of the world's biggest empire. In her final hours, she appeared in a home movie, but it did nothing to make her more famous. It wasn't meant to. The same applied to the Russian novelist Count Leo Tolstoy. His books were translated while he was still alive. He was as famous as Dickens. The reading public all over the world, and many people who had never read anything thicker than a popular newspaper, knew that Tolstoy wrote very thick books. The only film footage he had time to appear in was a bit short of action and didn't make him more famous. It wasn't news. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a famous British writer who appeared on film, but the film didn't appear anywhere significant. It didn't make him any more famous. The creator of Sherlock Holmes believed in popularity and would have liked to have more of it, but for the moment, film wasn't a way of getting it. The same went for Rudyard Kipling. He was the most famous of all British writers, read throughout the British Empire. He would have been a natural for film, especially if it could have spoken. If film could have sung, Caruso's fame would have been different. It could scarcely have been more widespread. Caruso made some of the first gramophone records, and millions of people who never saw him sing in the opera house did hear him sing at home. Wives who didn't like the noise their husbands made in the bath said, "Who do you think you are, Caruso?" But a few scraps of film had nothing to do with that. All he did on celluloid was fool around for his friends. It wasn't news. Getting the cameras to where the news was happening, getting the film back again to where it could be developed, and then getting the developed film to where it could be shown, all needed quick transport, and the means of quick transport was still being invented. When the Wright brothers made their first flight, there was no movie camera there to catch it. The movie camera didn't arrive until they flew again. America was too big. For just a moment, a small country like France had the advantage. The French had a newsreel system up and running when their most intrepid team of aviators, Louis Blériot and his formidable moustache, prepared to fly the English Channel. Blériot set off to battle the air resistance created by his formidable moustache. He was on his way to becoming world famous. He made it, but he stayed world famous only in France. He didn't make fame a career. He was content to be a French national hero. Marie Curie, though born in Poland, was a French national heroine. She discovered radium, an extremely glamorous substance which gave off mysterious rays that journalists enjoyed writing about. She wasn't glamorous herself, but she didn't care. She won the Nobel Prize and every other prize and was proud of her calling. But she wasn't interested in fame. 30 years had to go by before the Americans finally managed to immortalize her by replacing the unglamorous reality with a glamorous fiction that the audience could appreciate.
Pierre, we have discovered a new element. An active element. The residue of the pitchblende. What was left over after I extracted the uranium and the thorium? It must be in there.
Where is it?
In the specifier. Close the curtains.
They had made her human. The real Madame Curie already was human, and the Greer-Garson version wasn't, but that was what fame did. Simplify what was real so that people could take it in. Simple stories for ordinary people. In America, where the people ruled, the century was only a few years old when an ambitious politician realized the possibilities. President Theodore Roosevelt gleefully cooperated with any printed organ which would run his photograph. He smelt votes and his whiskers bristled. He was so vibrant that the pictures almost moved. When the pictures did move, Teddy got into them at every opportunity. He was a complicated, brainy man who realized that a simple, manly image would win him fame, and fame would win him elections. He got the emphasis off his politics and onto his personality. A visionary who foresaw America's global dominance, he took steps to embody it personally, creating the first presidential photo opportunity for a motion picture camera, which proved to be an opportunity for the cameraman to be flattened by a falling tree. Tireless, shameless, a machine for converting energy into publicity and vice versa, Teddy strode forward to world fame over the dead bodies of thousands of animals. Teddy Roosevelt set a trend for 20th century American presidents to play the role as much as they filled the office. Later on, the presidents learned to be performers. Better still, the performers learned to be presidents. Looking back, it seems logical that if a president of the United States turned himself into a star, he would open a window of opportunity through which a star would one day emerge as president of the United States. But stardom had a long way to go before the day came when no president could afford not to be a performer. In the early 1900s, the people in the movies were just little figures on the screen, smaller than the people who were sitting in the dark watching. Some of the people in the movies were famous, but only because they'd become famous already in the previous century. Buffalo Bill, after a glittering 19th century career of slaughtering buffalo, had movies made about himself. Despite his command of such specialized Western techniques as the secret handshake to fool Indians, he didn't look as much like a cowboy as the screen cowboys did. Houdini, the great escapologist, had a fitful screen career based on his skills as a man who could get out of anything given a certain amount of time. Newsreel-style short-subject movies were set up to show his uncanny expertise in action. If it looked like a newsreel, the public might be just about ready to go on believing that the camera couldn't lie. But in a studio-made movie, everyone knew that Houdini didn't really have to go over Niagara. He only had to go past the camera in the watery grip of a small set of rapids much nearer Los Angeles. It was a silent admission that someone with more screen presence could have been going over Niagara instead. Sarah Bernhardt had been the most famous stage actress in France since about the time of the Battle of Waterloo. She was on her last legs when she starred on film as the dying Queen Elizabeth, so it was perhaps unfair to describe her late bid for screen fame as a flop. Unfair, but accurate. Isadora Duncan was another 19th century hangover. She was famous for dancing in an untutored, not to say unhinged manner, but her vigorous movements, though no doubt important to the early history of aerobics, all seemed a bit distant. Then something happened that turned 20th century fame into something else. The close-up. The close-up made film stars look lovely, handsome, intelligent, innocent, passionate, sensitive, heroic. The close-up made film stars. The close-up made all kinds of stars. Some of the most famous people of the century never made a movie. But they have all been in the movies, because one of the things that made them famous was the film camera's capacity to make the face so big. Larger than life, it took on more meaning than it had in reality. A new and strange relationship was established between those looked at and those doing the looking. It was almost erotic. It was more than intimate. Radiant in the distance, yet close enough to taste, the people in close-up were symbolic, but what they symbolized was the people watching them. It was a way for the human race to worship itself in ideal form. It happened in public, but it was as private as self-love. The first film studios had to have stars. When the stars realized how necessary they were, their salary went up from $5 a week to 500 times that much in the first 4 years. The studios paid out not just because they couldn't do without the stars, but because big money kept the stars on a short leash. They couldn't do without it. They felt the same way about their fame. Most of them are now forgotten. At the time, they were part of the scenery. Some of them acted like it, but it didn't matter. Looks were everything. Looking the part was what the new style heroes did. Still thinking of America as a provincial place where a washed-up act went to make money, Europe continued producing the old-style heroes, real ones who actually did things, even if they didn't do them very well. Intrepid, if inept, none was more heroic than the Antarctic explorer Robert Falcon Scott. Though hopeless when it came to the petty practical details which merely meant the difference between life and death, Scott was aware of the value of publicity and took film cameras with him as far south as he could. But he didn't neglect to keep a diary as well. The diary later became a bestseller and helped to establish Scott as a hero in the old style, waging a private, lonely interior battle with destiny. His blunders were forgotten. He was enshrined as an example of the best type of British officer, with a stiff, indeed frozen, upper lip. He was an example to his class, and later in the century became the embodiment of his nation, when the whole disastrous expedition was staged all over again at Ealing Studios.
Sir! There.
Amundsen.
Yes, Scott had very Britishly arrived second. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had got on with the job, reached the pole first, and returned without fanfare to become famous in Norway. But even Scott is less famous outside his country than the people inside his country tend to think. The British liked him because he was decent about coming second. He was a national hero, and there was already something outdated about national heroes. The World Heavyweight Boxing Championship became an American monopoly when Jack Johnson revealed a frightening ability to obliterate all opposition from other countries, as if only America really counted. America's white men didn't like it when Johnson went out with white women. They locked him up for it. America's white men hoped for a white version of Johnson to emerge and take the title. This dreamed-of savior was called the Great White Hope, but there was no question that he would be anything else except American. America seemed as good as the rest of the world put together, perhaps because it was the rest of the world put together. The point was rubbed in when the First World War started. It was strictly a European event. America wasn't interested. As the slaughter commenced, the war's most famous person was Britain's Lord Kitchener. Essentially, he was an institution behind a lot of facial hair, like Westminster Abbey overgrown with ivy. When he inspected troops, they found it hard to inspect him. He was almost invisible behind the shrubbery. As the total of dead mounted into the millions, gradually it became apparent that hirsute institutions wouldn't do as heroes. The fighting man was the hero. He had to be a hero every day for as long as he lasted. But he didn't look like one. The average soldier was covered in mud. The average soldier was dead. Individuals were hard to find. Glamorous women spies were in short supply. Britain's nurse Edith Cavell died a heroic death before a German firing squad. Unfortunately, she was no Mata Hari and never caught the whole world's imagination. Mata Hari was a better bet. She danced seductively until mesmerized generals handed her their secrets. Few photographs of her were ever taken. Later on, Hollywood had plenty of room for imagination when Mata Hari spied again. Though the Hollywood Mata Hari had a bigger clothes allowance than the original, she suffered from the same problem. She was more interesting dancing than spying. But Mata Hari was the only glamorous female spy the war produced, so there was no choice. What the war really required was a few glamorous male warriors. They showed up above the battlefield in the form of ace pilots. Actually, the war in the air was mainly a matter of shooting the other guy in the back if you could, but at least it looked as if a man could show honor to a gallant opponent, survive by skill, and die on his own terms. In the clean showroom high above the muddy massacre, single aerial combat looked like chivalry. Germany made a hero out of Baron von Richthofen, the Red Knight of the Air, so called because he flew into action in a little red Fokker triplane. For purposes of raising morale, the German High Command poured on the publicity. Richthofen became a hero to all Germany. He was a legend to our side as well, a bit of a swine, but symbolizing human individuality in a war that had wiped it out. The Australian soldiers who shot him down gave him a hero's funeral. Later on, he was dug up and the Germans buried him all over again. The Red Baron had been above the battle, in a neat little war of his own. The previously obscure Middle East shared the same advantage as the sky above the Western Front. There was no mud. It looked clean. It was the perfect stamping ground for Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was T.E. Lawrence, a gigantic ego well camouflaged as a neurotically shy, short man. He had a knack for backing nervously into the limelight. The limelight was provided by the American journalist Lowell Thomas, who sent back reports about this exotic Englishman who dressed up as an Arab and went tearing around the desert like Sir Galahad in a sheet. Thomas also arranged for a newsreel camera car to chase Lawrence's camel. Thomas played up the story for all and more than it was worth, hitching his wagon to Lawrence's romantic star. America was suitably intrigued, but the exotic Englishman's heroic stature was of importance mainly to the English. Lawrence was a national hero. Aided by a gift for telling tales as elaborately decorated as his presentation jeweled dagger, he had made the war look like old-fashioned daring do. Peace was less exciting. Either honestly revolted by his publicity or aiming for legendary status, or both, he tried to hide from his fame under various assumed names, eventually killing himself on a powerful motorcycle. At the time, his passing was noted mainly by his friends, the British ruling class for whom he had been a golden boy. His true fame only happened 40 years after his death, when the movie came out. Though they had cast the part of one of the world's shortest heroes with one of the world's tallest actors, Peter O'Toole was at least an Irish actor, if not entirely British. And the film did have a British director, David Lean. But it was an American movie, arriving at the event a few decades late and taking it over. The movie replaced the man. Lawrence, the movie, served as a model for a new generation of American film directors who built their own empires on the profits of big-budget children's movies. Lawrence was all they knew of the British Empire, a legend riding to immortality. Boycotted by America until the 11th hour, the First World War went on exterminating its own extras in the modern manner while producing few stars who didn't look old hat. The Russian Revolution did better. It produced Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Lenin. Or rather, Lenin produced it, and he produced it in every sense. Lenin staged the revolution as a theatrical event, as well as a political one. If he didn't personally arrange to give himself top billing, it was only because he didn't have to. Dedicated apparatchiks did it for him, making him the center of attention for a propaganda system which right from the start was the most efficient thing in the Soviet Union apart from the secret police. Lenin was the symbol of centralized and unquestioned power, the embodiment of a new civilization which would replace the old Western version. To his own people, he was a demigod. After his early death, they rained tears into his open coffin, all unaware that he was never going to go away. The corpse was never buried. Lenin's face became a death mask, which became the mold for 1 million reproductions. First gradually, then grotesquely, Lenin, after death, was raised to divine status. On permanent display inside his aggressively hideous mausoleum under the Kremlin wall, Lenin's corpse, pumped full of artificial preservatives, became Moscow's longest-running hit show, a symbolic wedge destined to keep the world divided for as long as it took capitalism to crumble. The Lenin of the West was Henry Ford. Ford put his name on the century like no one else. He put America on wheels and the whole world followed. He turned the automobile from a privileged carriage into a mass-market consumer utensil. He was hailed as a genius with a vision of the new, infinitely mobile democratic society. The Ford Motor Company was the new America. Ford's success at creating an industrial empire was so enormous that delusions of grandeur came drifting with the smoke from his factories to his house. His fame went to his head. He rated himself as an original thinker on world affairs. His critics were nearer the mark when they called him an anti-Semite and a hayseed. In his saner moments, he seemed to agree that the backwoods were where he belonged. He had home movies made in which he featured as a simple soul, communing with the elements. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he proved this by attacking trees. In old age, he just didn't match up to his historical significance when he seized the microphone and spoke.
Mr. Hoover is carrying a greater burden than Abraham Lincoln carried, and he is carrying it in a way that places him beside Lincoln in sacrificial service. When he has got
his voice came stumbling out of the 19th century, when what a man did was what counted, and his personality didn't have to match his renown.
I think of him as a human-hearted, honest-minded, hard-working Hoover.
In the 20th century, he was better off on a private picnic. While other, more assured famous people got classier mileage out of his invention, he went lurching through the back blocks like King Lear on wheels. No less an industrial center than Ford's Detroit, Hollywood was more up to date. The Star Systems production line turned out personalities too good for this world. Stardom was a parallel world ruled by the people in it, with no one below the rank of prince and princess. The king and queen were Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Pickford was America's sweetheart. She had innocence. Fairbanks was the athletic hero. He had athleticism the way some dogs have rabies. He had 2 rows of teeth in each jaw. Even off-screen, they were on-screen, living in a house on a hill that was like a castle where all the world's famous people came to pay court. The young British aristocratic couple, Lord and Lady Mountbatten, made an early start on a long career of being noble friends to the famous. On screen, Doug and Mary were a fairy tale. They chose their costumes from the vast walk-in wardrobe of the romantic past. They were modern heroes, but the heroes they played were a hangover from another era. The same applied to Rudolph Valentino. No man in history had aroused so much female desire. But he looked as if he came from history, or anyway from somewhere exotic. was a gaucho who danced the tango. He was a bullfighter who got gored. But mainly, he was the sheik. He was Lawrence of Arabia with a degree in Latin American dancing. He was something else. Valentino was equipped with a smouldering glance that could reach all the way to the cheap seats and scorch the spit curl on a flapper's forehead to a frazzled pretzel. Valentino had a violinist's hands, which the camera dwelt on as his female fans dreamed of being held like a Stradivarius at various strategic angles. For the studio publicity department, Rudy was gold dust. They set up sex appeal tests to measure his cataclysmic effect on the female metabolism. Off-screen, Valentino was obliged to keep up his performance as a great lover with magic powers of sexual attraction and infinite supplies of savoir-faire. In real life, he had been a male taxi dancer and freelance lounge lizard, but real life had been left far behind. When he tried to make a few artistically significant movies on his own account, he almost went bankrupt. He found out that he was a prisoner of his fame. The public wanted the sheik. He came back as son of the sheik. They had changed the girl, but it was the same tent. He knew his way around it blindfold, and barring accidents, he would have gone on to make grandson of the sheik and Sheik Trek 5, The Voyage Home, perpetually transporting upper-class young women over a sand dune for immoral purposes, his palpitating victim the object of toxic envy from untold millions of watching women as she echoed the curve of the great lover's dagger while he bent her to his will on cushions hot from the sand beneath. Valentino was merely the most sensational example of a performer whose real-life personality became confused with an outlandish persona. The man and the role were two different things, and it was becoming evident that if the man couldn't control the role would control the man. Buster Keaton seemed to have the whole business buttoned up. On screen, he was a helpless victim of events. His body worked brilliantly to get him out of situations he had been led into by a brain that scarcely seemed to be working at all. Behind the scenes, Keaton was the man in charge. It didn't look like it, but he was calling the shots. As long as his films were hits, he was given control of them by the studio. But he never took out any life insurance against the day when things might go wrong. He wasn't safety-minded, and although other comedians realized that he was a unique talent, he was content for the public merely to find him funny. Keaton was a great artist whose fame just happened to him. Charlie Chaplin made his fame happen. He wasn't just a character, even though the character, thanks to the nearly universal reach of silent film, was the most recognizable figure on Earth. The man who played the role made himself famous too. Chaplin enthusiastically cooperated with the publicity that built him up as a genius who had the whole picture under his personal control. With the fame of the real man added to the fame of the role he created, Chaplin filled the sky as the most famous person in the world. There had never been fame on that scale before. When Chaplin toured his native England, it wasn't like going home. It was like going to a foreign country, the fame country, which started just outside his front gate in Hollywood and covered the whole planet, full of people who wanted to shake his hand but didn't care if it bled. The price of adulation was isolation. Chaplin found himself cut off from the mass of mankind that adored him. Only other famous people could behave naturally in his presence. Lord and Lady Mountbatten, still hot on the trail of the famous, turned up to be included in a private honeymoon movie which Chaplin made especially for them, entitled Nice and Friendly. Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks were like little boys together because they were trying to imagine what it might have been like to have met each other before they were famous. Cut off from ordinary people, the film stars were trapped with each other, paying for the upkeep of high walls to shut the public out. When Fairbanks and Pickford toured Europe, they found to their horror that their loving public was ready to crush the life out of them. There was no way back from this kind of fame. Anyone who got it was stuck with it. Unprecedented fame brought unprecedented problems, which not even the smartest stars could yet guess at. They had to find out the hard way. Fatty Arbuckle found out the hardest way. A modern comedian who ranked with Chaplin and Keaton in the affections of the public, Arbuckle off-screen felt short of love and tried to supply the deficiency in ill-advised ways. Famous for being even more lovable than Keaton as a little boy who got into trouble, in real life, he had a dangerous knack for getting into trouble with big girls. Arrested after a bit-part actress died at a party in circumstances that were never made clear, Arbuckle was destroyed by the press before he could be tried in court. His career as an artist was over because he hadn't managed it like a businessman. Chaplin had the same weakness for women, but his lawyer was always at his elbow. Arbuckle was less well protected. Fame needed a clear, cool head. It needed a head like hers. She seemed to have the whole thing figured out in advance. Her name was Greta Gustafsson, and she started off by being famous in Sweden. She was a substantial girl with a disarmingly natural set of teeth, but she had something, a ticket to America. After a change of name and a rewarding encounter with a cosmetic dentist, Greta Garbo held America enthralled. Americans knew Sweden was in Europe somewhere, and Europe was where women were aloof, blasé, and so sophisticated they made love with the light on. This wasn't Mary Pickford looking winsome in a dirndl. This was sexual desire. This was the very first time the American screen had shown a kiss happening horizontally, the way they did it in Europe. The movies were still silent, but Garbo's silence was eloquent. It didn't just say, your place or mine, it said, your place and mine. It was widely assumed that Garbo and John Gilbert were not acting. This was especially easy to believe in Gilbert's case. He fell in love with her off-screen. So did romantics of both sexes in dark cinemas everywhere. Garbo moved love to the ethereal level for millions of ordinary people all over the world who didn't have much time for love on any level. She made them see what they were missing. She did it for them. Complained when the studio stills photographers made her pose for hours while they angled lights to reduce her face to the minimum of information. She understood exactly what they were after, ideal sex. Garbo firmly squashed all attempts by the studio to invent a private life for her. The studio soon got the point. Mystery made her a bigger star. If the studio couldn't publicize her private life, it could publicize her reluctance to reveal it. It was the enigma effect. Whether she calculated this effect, or whether she just found all the hoo-ha too silly to get mixed up in, remains a mystery to this day, like almost everything else about her. But few famous people were as instinctively wary about their fame as Garbo. They had to learn. Everybody did. 20th century fame glowed in the dark, but nobody had any reason to believe that something which shone so seductively could burn as well, that it would have to be handled with care, that it would take special suits and lead shields to step into all that light and still breathe. A few shrewd people like Garbo and Chaplin had already guessed that the real story of 20th century fame would be how to live with it, but not even that became clear until someone died of it. It was Valentino. If he had been operated on in time, he might have been saved, but they couldn't find a surgeon to match his prestige. It was a botch, like much of his life. But his death was a theatrical triumph. People queued to get in. The funeral started in New York, where the queue to see his body became a riot. The body crossed the country by train. The funeral in Hollywood was razzmatazz in mourning. Other stars wept for their own mortality along with his. But for millions of women all over the world, his loss was the occasion of real and lasting grief, which pundits preferred to call mass hysteria. Why else should otherwise normal people feel love for a dreamed object, passion for an illusion, and treat the life and death of a man who wore funny hats as if it was a matter of life and death? It was the death of innocence. Fame was a force, and the proof was in the box.
Be sure to join us for Chapter 2 of Fame in the 20th Century next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Right now, stay tuned for TV 12 Spotlight, followed at 10 o'clock by American Playhouse presenting La Carpa. That's all coming up here on TV 12.